Einen wunderschönen guten Tag für Sie alle. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zu diesem ersten Tag der zweitägigen Klimakonferenz mit dem Titel „Was jetzt zu tun ist?" Und ich begrüße Sie sowohl ganz herzlich hier im Saal als natürlich auch an den Bildschirmen, wo Sie zu Hunderten versammelt sind. Und das freut uns sehr. Toll, dass Sie alle dabei sind. Ich habe einen kurzen organisatorischen Hinweis, weil wir natürlich möchten, dass Sie sich auch ganz aktiv an dieser Konferenz beteiligen können. Und das funktioniert über Slido. Wir werden Ihnen jetzt einen QR-Code einblenden, den können alle Beteiligten hier im Saal, auch hier direkt von dem Bildschirm, abscannen. Und Sie können das zu Hause natürlich auch an Ihren Bildschirmen tun. Und sollte da irgendwas nicht so gut klappen, dann gehen Sie einfach auf die Seite slido.com und dort geben Sie dann das angegebene Kennwort ein, was Sie auch hier nochmal sehen. Das lautet 156936. Und das ist erstmal ein wichtiger Hinweis zu Ihrer Beteiligung. Und jetzt kommen wir aber direkt zu einem inhaltlichen Überblick und wollen direkt starten, um keine unnötige Zeit zu verlieren. Und legen los. Ich begrüße ganz herzlich hier auf der Bühne Rainer Baake als Direktor der Stiftung Klimaneutralität. Wird er Sie jetzt nicht nur begrüßen, sondern auch einen kurzen Abriss über das Programm geben. Ganz herzlich willkommen auf der Bühne.
Vielen Dank. Ja, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, auch von meiner Seite herzlich willkommen. Wir haben uns vorgenommen, der Frage nachzugehen in den nächsten 2 Tagen, was jetzt zu tun ist auf Deutschlands Weg zur Klimaneutralität. Es ist wunderbar, dass wir wieder in einem Saal mit real existierenden Menschen zusammenkommen können. Natürlich in begrenzter Zahl aufgrund der Corona-Vorschriften. Wir haben aber viele Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer aus der ganzen Bundesrepublik, die jetzt zugeschaltet sind. Wir haben Anmeldungen aus allen Teilen von Deutschland und auch aus dem Ausland. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, die Sie uns jetzt an den Bildschirmen verfolgen, ein herzliches Willkommen. Sie haben dem Programm entnommen, dass wir eine ganze Reihe von hochinteressanten Rednerinnen und Rednern heute und Podiumsteilnehmern auf der Tagesordnung haben. Wir haben uns inhaltlich vorgenommen, mit den wichtigen Sektoren, die für die Erreichung der Klimaziele eine große Bedeutung haben, uns intensiv auseinanderzusetzen. Und wir werden auch einige übergreifende Themen behandeln, wie zum Beispiel das Thema Wasserstoff oder was sind die juristischen Folgen des bemerkenswerten Klimaurteils des Bundesverfassungsgerichts. Und zwischendurch werden wir Interviews mit interessanten Persönlichkeiten haben, wo wir die Teilnehmer gebeten haben, uns ihre ganz persönliche Sicht auf das Klimathema hier kundzutun. Morgen Nachmittag kommen dann 3 CEOs von bedeutenden großen deutschen Unternehmen. Die werden präsentieren, wie ihre Unternehmensstrategie auf dem Weg zur Klimaneutralität aussieht. Und last but not least, am Ende kommt dann die Politik. 3 Parteien wollen die nächste Bundeskanzlerin oder den nächsten Bundeskanzler stellen. Olaf Scholz wird zu uns sprechen für die SPD, Robert Habeck für Bündnis 90 Die Grünen und Andreas Jung für die Union. Meine Damen und Herren, wenn wir über die nationalen Grenzen hinausschauen, dann tut sich beim Klimathema aus meiner Sicht gegenwärtig so etwas wie ein Fenster der Gelegenheiten auf. Europa war der Erste, der gesagt hat, wir wollen klimaneutral werden, 2050. Dann folgte im letzten Jahr China und in diesem Jahr nach der Wahl von Joe Biden auch die USA. Und wenn wir nur diese 3 Wirtschaftsräume nehmen, China, USA und Europa, dann sind das bereits mehr als 50% der globalen Treibhausgasemissionen. Aber es sind ja mehr dazu gekommen. Japan, Südkorea, Kanada. Die Liste ist inzwischen sehr umfangreich. Das heißt, es wird jetzt natürlich auch um die Frage gehen, wer hat die beste Strategie auf dem Weg zur Klimaneutralität. Dabei steht natürlich das Thema Klimaschutz im Mittelpunkt, aber es geht auch um die Frage, wer hat mit seinen Klimaschutztechnologien Erfolg auf den Märkten von morgen. The race is on, würden die Amerikaner sagen. Und das ist jetzt die Überleitung zu unserem ersten Gast. Wir sind sehr froh, heute Hal Harvey hier bei uns begrüßen zu dürfen. Hal ist CEO von Energy Innovation, einem Think Tank aus den USA. Er ist außerdem auch der Vorsitzende unseres Beirats. And Hal, you have been a leader in the debate over energy transition and climate solutions in the US, not for years, actually for decades. You have served on the advisory panels of several American presidents, and we know that John Kerry listens very carefully when you speak. So we are very happy to have you here today. Hal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rana. So it's a great honor to be here today, and I want to thank the organizers for this. I think everyone knows this is the do or die decade. We have to move rapidly, and I'm going to show you a couple graphs here to explain what's going on here. The framing for climate change these days is a 2050 target, or a 2045 target, or a 2060 target, depending on the country. Those are important framing questions, but the real issue is what do we do in the next decade? Because if we waste this next decade, if we fail to be really smart and really rapid, there is no safe landing space. It's over. Let me show you a stylized different scenarios for, depending on start date, how fast you have to reduce. The first shallowest point on the curve, the first shallowest curve, the magenta one, is what we could have done, the rate at which we could have changed had we gotten going about 10 years ago. The next one, the green one, is if we had got going now. It's quite a bit steeper and less time. If we waste a decade or so, it becomes so steep it becomes impossible. It would require economic catastrophe to meet those steeper later lines. So we can't miss this round here. This gets into this question of what makes a pathway credible. What is Europe's pathway? What is America's? What is Korea or South Korea or Japan or China, countries that have made pledges to the endpoint? How do we know that they mean it? How do we know it will arrive at a meaningful time? I would argue the first thing is there has to be a clear pathway to zero for each sector. If we cannot understand how physical items in the economy change, how boilers and power plants and vehicles and buildings change, physically change, then it's not a plan. And that's a pretty high bar. What do we need to do? What are these things? We have to get electricity to zero first and fastest. Why first and fastest? Because it's the cheapest to get to zero, and because all the other zeros for transportation, buildings, and industry rely on zero carbon electricity. I would argue 2038 is too late for the coal sector, for example. We have to get the whole grid to zero. By the way, this is the first and most important element in President Biden's climate plan, is to drive the grid to zero by 2035. These are simplifications, of course, but electric vehicles are the next huge leverage point. And we can't wait until the grid is perfect. We have to start deployment now. A lot of people think we can declare victory with electric vehicles. It's under 2% of sales. That's not victory. That's day one. And keep in mind that vehicles last about 14 years. So the other 98% of cars sold today will still be on the road 14 years hence, on average. In buildings, people have worked for years to do energy efficiency retrofits of buildings, and I'm all in favor of them, but we have to go much faster than that. It's never been more than 1 or 2% per year. It takes a century at current rates in the United States to turn over the building stock with clean technology. So what do we need to do? It's inelegant, but it works. Replace burners, replace boilers with heat pumps and drive them off a zero carbon grid. And that requires building code standards, no more sales of conventional furnaces, no more hookups of natural gas. If we don't face that squarely, the building sector fails, and we can't afford any failures here. And industry is the hardest one, and it's the one that's been most neglected by academia, by NGOs, and even by the negotiators. And that's because it is complex and the capital structures are deep and embedded. We need specific tractable pathways for each of the top 5 or 8 industries, for iron and steel, for concrete, for chemicals, for fertilizers. Because without those pathways, pursued aggressively and pursued now, we cannot get to a reasonable climate future. And just to put a sharp edge on this, 70% of China's carbon emissions come from their industrial sector. That's more than any other country. And they need a pathway as much as anyone does. All of that has to be backed up with national policy, sector by sector. A carbon price is a very useful thing. It is no substitute, however, for sector by sector policies. It's important to do some sorting by country size. The G20 have 80% of global carbon emissions. That's the realm for focus. I'm going to talk very briefly about, I'm going to do in the order of US, China, and the European Union. So President Biden has made climate change one of his 4 priorities, along with getting the economy running again, dealing with the pandemic, and dealing with racism. The first 2 are well underway, or even conceivably done. Racism will take a long time. He's also pushing that very hard. The question is, how hard will he and how successfully will he push climate change? The American system has the president's goals go through rather an antiquated and inefficient decision-making system called the US Congress. And I predict there will be a reasonable infrastructure bill that gets passed in the US Congress. It will not be sufficient for what we need to do with climate. It absolutely will not. That leaves 2 important avenues. The first is to do by regulation what you cannot do by legislation. The Clean Air Act in the United States, which was signed originally in 1972, grants the EPA authority to deal with any air pollutant. The EPA has declared CO2 an air pollutant, and the Supreme Court has upheld this on a 5-4 vote. Now, that was with the old Supreme Court. Now we have the Trump Supreme Court, so that could be revisited. But in the meantime, the president has the ability to establish strong climate regulations and strong climate standards. And he will do that once he either succeeds or fails in the US Congress. The work is getting ready for that. The final point I need to make about the United States is the individual states, climate, California, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, more than half the population now lives in states with clean energy governors and clean energy pledges. So we can get there state by state. It's messy, it's ugly, it's slow, but it works. So US carbon emissions have been going down pretty rapidly. They need to accelerate. We have the tools to get that done. I think we will get it done. Let me turn to China. Between China and the US, you have almost half the carbon in the global economy. China is obviously the biggest of them all, almost twice or maybe twice the size of the United States. President Xi Jinping has called for carbon abatement reductions. He's talked about strict control of coal. He set a goal for 0 net carbon emissions by 2060, a decade later than the others, arguing that a young country with a growing economy needs more time to get there. They have more distance. Those are all good pledges. They're not enough by a considerable degree. It's my opinion that there are other fantastic options for China and that they are pursuing them, but they haven't committed them yet. One of them I've listed here is to increase clean energy generation to 2,000 gigawatts total by 2030. It's a huge number. But if you took China's peak renewable energy deployment, which was last year, and continued it up to 2030, you'd hit that number. The fastest way to get rid of coal is to displace it. You cannot get rid of it simply by turning it off, because that will threaten the stability of the grid. And no political system survives blackouts and brownouts for long. Another important point, which a number of countries, and the G7 just called for this in their latest meeting, is to quit external finance of coal-fired power plants. For God's sake, we have to stop building the things that are going to kill us. It's just elementary. And to have formal state actors continuing to finance coal-fired power plants is, in my opinion, simply immoral. It's also impractical and it's uneconomical, but it's immoral. I think if you look at China is also in the middle of drafting the details on its 14th five-year plan. There are sector-specific plans, there are provincial plans. I've seen this process up close a few times now. I'm convinced that they will be considerably more aggressive, province by province and city by city, than the national standards call for. So I think we are in for happy surprises, but still a long way to go in China. So let me finally turn to, second to last, to the European Union. It is an amazing step that the European Union committed to 55% reductions in 2030 compared to 1990. And it's further amazing that the federal courts in Germany said that Germany will have to go farther and go faster, and 65% is now on the table. That entails a lot of work. Those are very courageous statements. Until they are backed up by specific national policies at the European level and specific sectoral policies at the country level, they're just words. The European emissions trading system is finally becoming meaningful. That will be very helpful, but it's not dispositive because too many sectors of the economy are essentially impervious to pricing. People don't buy a house according to how much energy it uses. They buy a house according to its location, affordability, kitchen, decor, quietness of the streets, and so forth. And so you can change energy prices quite significantly, as has happened, and it doesn't change the elasticity in the building sector is close to zero. In transportation, it's surprisingly small as well. If you called European gas tax a carbon tax, just rename it, it would be about $300 a ton already. And we nonetheless need fuel efficiency standards. So for Europe, I think what needs to be done is the energy efficiency directives, as they get renewed at the European level, and the transportation directives, as they get renewed, have to be extremely strong. They have to be so strong that they compel electricity, that they compel electric vehicles and electrically heated buildings. That's entirely feasible and it's cost effective. The principal obstacle is no longer technology, no longer economics, it's incumbency. It will be the resistance of incumbent industries to this. Europe has led the way again and again, and I tell you, it matters in this market with 500 million people. It matters in America, it matters in in China, it matters emphatically, because that leadership shows that it can be done. It develops new business models, new technologies, new opportunities. It turns a powerful idea into a powerful reality. So we absolutely need European leadership here. Again, that means country by country, national sector-specific laws. There is simply no alternative to doing that. Let me turn finally to a few things that can be done together. And I'm going fast because there's a lot to think about here. There's an obscure treaty called the Minamata Treaty that can be used, if it's voted upon by the member states, to ban fluorescent lamps. Seems like a small deal, but it takes a lot of mercury. It's a mercury treaty. Europe's party to it, so is the United States, so is China. The African nations have proposed this ban. It's time for Europe to stand up and say, we agree. With LEDs in existence, why in God's name would we make fluorescent lamps, which are filled with poison, mercury, and are inefficient, and they flicker? Nasty. That's something, and there are other steps, for example, accelerating the reduction of HFCs, getting really serious about methane leaks. There are a bunch of unilateral moves that I think Europe and the United States and China should make prior to COP26 to show goodwill, to show momentum, and to show respect for other countries. The other realm in which I think we could and should collaborate is on sector-specific pathways for heavy industry. As I said before, for steel, for concrete, for chemicals, for fertilizer, for non-ferrous metals. Until we have a plan for each of those, and it will require new technology, it will require some price premiums, it will require some market adjustments, it will require supply chain action. Until we do those things, there is no hope and no plan for rapidly decarbonizing the industrial sector. And that should be a joint project. Of course, there will be trade secrets and technologies that belong to individual companies or individual countries. But a commitment to build this pathway together is going to be absolutely crucial. And we're not in the game at all. That has a long way to go. Let me conclude with this. Those of us who have had the misfortune of going to a lot of COP meetings remember Copenhagen, which was so depressing, because it was all about an allocation of burden. Who will pay, who will sacrifice how much? In order to win, this has to be about an allocation of opportunity. We should all be striving to own the clean technologies of the future, and we should do this together. That was the spirit of Paris. It now needs to become the law, the regulation, the technology development pathway, the new route to go. So with that, I will conclude, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hal Harvey, for this global perspective.